Hi, garden rebels. It's trimming time of the year. It's one of my favorite times. I want to go over the technique that I use to trim around the nursery and in my own garden as well. Might help you in your garden and on your plants. All those details coming up. Of course, talking about trimming always begins with tools. And the reason why I spend a little bit of time on that is because if you take the time to make sure that the blade is nice and sharp, the tool is nice and comfortable for you, that it goes a long ways for you in wearing out your body, but also it goes well for the plants and that it gets a nice sharp clean cut. And if you get a nice sharp clean cut, you won't get as much browning or burn from the edges of your cut. So weeks from now it'll still be a nice green cut. This also reminds me right here that weather plays an important part in your trimming as well. Now normally I say trim when it's convenient for you. Really, some of the plants that we're going to trim, you can trim any time of the year. But do keep an eye out on the weather. If it's really intensely hot, trimming is going to be very, very hard on your plants. And that's when you'll oftentimes get that burn after trimming, because you'll trim and you'll be exposing some of those inner leaves that haven't been used to that intense light, and that all at once is essentially a sunburn on your plants. So if it's an overcast day, if you got some cool weather ahead of you, that's picture perfect. Back to tools. Now tools is a funny business in that there are a lot of different levels of quality, of course, but a sharp blade is really the most important. So you can get a cheaper tool as long as it has a sharp blade. And that's why I like to emphasize that always having a sharpener in your back pocket. Anytime you have a shears, you have a sharpener. And of course, I like our particular type of sharpener. It's an easy to use, not particularly about any angles at all. It's just run it right along that blade. And you can hear it, you can just hear it getting sharper every time. Don't need to do it very often, by the way. Do need to do it on both sides of the blade as well. It's like you're preparing for battle. Now, of course, the tool that I use is this ARS. It's KR1000. I do a lot of trimming, and I'll show you what I trim. So I want to invest in a tool that takes a lot of abuse. And also, the nice thing about this particular set of shears is that it is very trimmable. You remove this little screw here, removes this base, this plate, and I can tighten it to the resistance that I like the most, just as long as the blade comes together. So in a nice clean tightness, there's no space in between the blades. Ooh, you see a little bit of light there. I can see a little bit of light. I can probably tighten this up a bit. and it does feel a little bit sloppy. Let's do that first. Some smaller types of shears can come in handy too. That there's a sense of control when you trim. HS715 that I use a lot too, especially in smaller shrubs that need a little bit more detail and a little bit more control. Shear and move, shear and move. Shear and move, shear and move, shear and move, shear and move. Trim and move, trim and move. Notice every time I trim, I am moving the blade. And the other thing to notice is that for this round circular ball of a topiary that I am cutting, I am just using the last third, the last tip third of the blade on a flat topiary, on something that I have a lot more. I would certainly use most of the blade, but count on using just the last tip of the third for a rounded sphere. Another pointer after trimming all of these boxwoods is that usually I'll position myself and trim every part of that topiary that I can from that position, and then change my position to trim another section of it. That's right.
And here's how they cut it.
There's a cutter in the middle of it.
How are you doing?
All good, all good.
Well, thank you for such a pleasing view.
Okay.
Enjoy your day.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you.
One final thought on trimming, particularly on the boxwoods, is that on flat surfaces, I can definitely take advantage of using much more of the blade. So it's nearly the entire blade I can use to cut. This gives me a massive amount of cutting power for each stroke of cut. Makes it easier and faster. And one final thought is on corners. Those are the most tricky. So take your time cutting the corners, and cutting the actual corner is the very last cut. So take your time and make sure it's nice and straight. Gives a great sense of detail to your boxwood sculpture. Not just boxwoods, but if you have European hornbeams, those are an excellent one to trim as well. This is a Carpinus. I love the Carpinuses, by the way. This is Carpinus fastigiata, so it's a very columnar type of tree. I love this tree because it reminds me, believe it or not, of a Ruffles potato chip. The same thing applies on the corners, by the way. Nice straight corners makes a huge difference. Need more reasons to clip and trim? If you have the Ligustrums texanum, that is the wax leaf privet. Now is a great time to prune those, especially after they've finished blooming. They'll leave those old blooms on, a great time to trim. And lastly on the list to trim, believe it or not, could be your hanging baskets. Now hanging baskets you want to grow just like you would like them. Most folks like a nice well-rounded basket, and sometimes plants just don't grow that way. Possible to give them a good trim too. Trimming them keeps them a little bit tighter. Now, trimming a hanging basket I find to be a little bit different task, and that I really start on the outside edges. Find those stray branches and stems that might just look a little bit odd, and just trim those off, as well as the height on some plants too. The one nice thing about trimming your basket is that these are annuals, so they will grow back much quicker. So I'm never too worried about trimming too much, but I do trim just purely for looks. And there you have it. That's the quick tips on trimming. By the way, trimming of baskets is not entirely necessary. This is only if you feel as if your basket is really mal-shaped and you want to prune that back. Guys, that's the tips and tricks for this week. Always live your passion. I've got more trimming